What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about the best units in every single Space Marine chapter, or specifically, those chapters that have a supplement. Except for Blood Ravens. Sorry, Blood Ravens fans, your supplement sucks. Today, we're going to be focusing on units that each chapter has particular synergy with. There are some units that are good in every single Space Marine army, and are certainly some of the best units you can take in the Space Marine Codex, regardless of what chapter you are. But filling an entire video with talking about how good Relic and Tempter Dreadnoughts or Incursor squads or Vanguard Veteran squads are in any given Space Marine army is pretty boring. As always, if you like this style of video, drop a like, drop a subscribe to the channel, drop a comment down below telling me what Space Marine chapter you play, and if you think I got any of these picks wrong. After you've done that, just watch the rest of the video, so let's do it. We'll go down in alphabetical order, and that means we're going to start with the Black Templars. Now, this is a bit of an interesting one. You can't go wrong in a Black Templars army by starting with a couple Crusader squads. These guys are super cheap troop options, just 15 points a model for a Tactical Marine stat line. You could even just take a bolt gun like you do on a normal Tactical Marine. There's almost literally no downside to taking Crusader squads over Tactical Marines. You just save yourself some points. That's awesome, but they do have some additional benefits as well. Most importantly, you can supplement the Initiates or the regular Space Marines in the squad with Neophytes, who are basically just Space Marine Scouts, not a particularly good profile, only 1 wound and a 4+ save, meaning they die pretty quickly, but they do give you access to the smokescreen keyword, meaning you can give your troop options -1 to hit with that smokescreen stratagem. So it's all good. Being able to take larger units of troop options, defend them more heavily with stratagems, and get them for cheaper than you would any other troops option, pretty good. There's really no way you can go wrong with these guys. Moving on, we'll talk about Blade Guard Veterans. Now, these guys are pretty good in every Space Marine chapter, but they do something pretty cool with Black Templars specifically, and that is using the Devout Push stratagem. This stratagem is absolutely wild. It allows you to pile into combat at the start of the fight phase, even if you're not engaged with any enemy units. It's basically a heroic intervention with some extra steps. Now that means there's a bunch of super cool things you can do with this stratagem. You can use it like a heroic intervention to counterattack into enemy units that are charging you. You can use it to move up and base enemy units that are engaging you to stop them from using their pile-in and consolidates, but also importantly, you can use it to extend your own threat range, since you can use the stratagem in your own fight phase. Now, this can obviously allow you to advance and then sort of charge. The big downside is that you do lose your charging bonus because you have not actually charged or been charged, so things like Shock Assault won't trigger, but it does allow you to make your advance roll and then use Devout Push to actually bring yourself into melee. One of the most interesting uses of this is out of an Impulsor, since you can move the Impulsor, get a unit of Blade Guard Veterans. I mean, any Primaris unit that can fit into an Impulsor can do this, but Blade Guard Veterans are certainly the most powerful melee option that Black Templars can fit into that vehicle. So that Impulsor moves 14 inches. You can then use the Assault Transport rule to disembark the Blade Guard Veterans, advance with them, and then use Devout Push to get them into melee. So for those keeping track, that's a 14-inch movement off the Impulsor, plus 3 inches for your disembark, another probably 9 inches. We'll call it 10, because you could potentially have a frontline commander in there for +1 to your advance rolls. So we're going 27 inches before piling into melee, meaning that these guys threat 31 inches with their engagement range. That is super crazy. Let's move on to the next chapter. We're talking about Blood Angels. These guys are kind of in a weird place right now, but they do have some powerful melee options. I've picked a couple units for this one. First off, Sanguinary Priests. They buff your melee, setting units into Assault Doctrine, even if the army's not in Assault Doctrine. Since Assault Doctrine benefits are usually the hardest to get to, because they only trigger on round 3, getting into them earlier is super duper powerful, and is going to unlock that +1 attack from the Blood Angel Super Doctrine ability even better. Sanguinary Priests are also apothecaries, which you often want to be taking in your Space Marine armies anyway, and can be upgraded to be a Chief Apothecary for that sweet free model resurrection every turn with the Selfless Healer Warlord trait. And they're good Aura Caddies, since they're going to be standing in the center of your formation anyway, so putting things like the Icon of the Angel for reroll charges within 6 inches, also good. One of the best units to receive that buff is our next pick, Sanguinary Guard. This is pretty self-explanatory. They're kind of like Vanguard Veterans with extra steps, except they have a gun, which is sweet. They're also -1 to hit in melee, which makes them very difficult to remove sometimes, and with a 2+ armor save, not having any access to an invulnerable save without applying something like Psychic Fortress to them, isn't the biggest deal, since a 2+ armor save, especially in cover, is usually going to be roughly equivalent to a 4+ invulnerable save in most instances. That means that they're not really losing too much defense, but with 2 damage, high strength melee attacks, as well as an assault ranged weapon, Sanguinary Guard are a phenomenal melee unit. Last, but certainly, I don't know, maybe least, it's not that exciting, but we have Inceptors. These guys can make use of the Descent of Angels stratagem to give themselves +1 to hit the turn that they come in, which isn't a huge synergy, but it is very nice to have, especially on a unit with such high value attacks. Moving on, we're going to talk about Imperial Fists / Crimson Fists. It's Crimson Fists first, that's why they're in this order. It's fine. This is a little bit of a weird one, since Imperial Fists don't have amazing synergy with too many of the units in the Space Marine Codex, but I do think it's important to talk about the Leviathan Dreadnought. With the changes to the Imperial Fists Super Doctrine in their 9th edition update, only Strength 7 and above weapons will get their +1 damage in the Devastator Doctrine when they're attacking vehicles, which means trying to get autocannon profiles into your list is the most efficient way to benefit from that Super Doctrine. That's a long-range Strength 7 AP1 2 damage profile, and Leviathan Dreadnoughts have those in spades. With 2 Storm Cannon arrays stapled to one of these guys, they're firing 16 shots at a potential AP2 3 damage, ignoring cover if you are in Imperial Fists. If you're Crimson Fists, things get a little bit more exciting, because vehicles only consider themselves 5 models for the purposes of the Crimson Fist chapter tactic, which means oftentimes a vehicle shooting at a slightly larger squad is going to get that +1 to hit, meaning that they're hitting on 2s. Even so, shooting at a vehicle with these guys, hitting for a flat 3 damage a pop at 16 shots is pretty solid. Moving on, let's talk about the Fire Raptor gunship a little bit. The big downside of a weapon like a Storm Cannon on that Leviathan Dreadnought in Imperial Fists is that it doesn't actually benefit from the Imperial Fists chapter tactic. This is one of the weirdest things about Imperial Fists, and one of the reasons that they're, not very good. But their chapter tactic specifically buffs bolt weapons, of which none of them are Strength 7 or above, so their Super Doctrine does not at all interact with their chapter tactic. Full stop. They also only get the benefit when they're shooting at vehicles. Vehicles don't usually benefit from cover. It doesn't really make sense. That said, a Fire Raptor gunship, while it doesn't benefit too much from the Super Doctrine, it does have a crap ton of bolt weapons on it. With the potential to mount 2 sets of quad heavy bolters, firing 12 heavy bolter profile shots, that's Strength 5 AP1, 2 damage at 36-inch range, and having a Twin Avenger bolt cannon, another bolt weapon because it says bolt in the name, that's the definition. For an additional 10 shots at Strength 6 AP2, this thing has a potential 34 exploding attacks with that Super Doctrine. In addition, it's also bringing those Hellstrike launchers, which are Strength 8 heavy weapons, meaning they are also going to get the benefit of that Super Doctrine if you are in Devastator. All good stuff from the Fire Raptor gunship, and while I think there are better chapters to use big vehicles like a Fire Raptor in, a big upside of Imperial Fists is that its damage output is going to be significantly improved. And with that, we'll move on to our next chapter. Let's talk about some different angels now, the Dark Angels. This is a really tough call because Dark Angels have so many good profiles and interesting synergies with different units in the Space Marine Codex. Today, I've elected to talk about the Deathwing Command Squad. Have you ever wanted to take Deathwing Terminators, who are already phenomenally difficult to kill with a 4+ invulnerable save, and you get an additional ability, the Bodyguard ability, for like basically no additional points? Let me introduce you to this Deathwing Command Squad. Able to be taken in units of as small as 2 models, you can intersperse Deathwing Command Squads into your army, making them an excellent counterpunch unit and protect your characters with that Bodyguard role without really paying any additional points for that ability over a normal Terminator squad. While they can only go up to 5 models, oftentimes you'll find yourself only wanting to be at 5 models with your Terminator squads anyway, so that's not the biggest deal. And the ability to mix and match different work gear options inside the unit, it's all gravy for the Deathwing Command Squad, and it's no surprise that you see 2 or 3 of these in almost every Dark Angels list. Now moving on, we'll talk about a Ravenwing unit. This time we're going to talk about the Talon Master. Ravenwing obviously focusing on the lighter, more agile styles of unit in the army. If you were looking for something to protect with that Bodyguard ability, the Talon Master is probably the perfect pick. It adds some significant shooting to your army with 2 heavy bolters and 2 assault cannons on this little land speeder body, is super duper fast, meaning it's very difficult to hide from, and can be untargetable, either benefiting from that bodyguard role or just a regular lookout sir since it's a sub 10 wound character. You can upgrade them with some incredible relics and warlord traits, and while they don't get very punchy in melee, their ability to fire into melee because they're a vehicle means that even engaging them, if you don't remove them, they're going to be able to still deal some significant damage back to you. Talon Masters are awesome. You also see a bunch of these guys in almost every Dark Angels list. And being able to deal damage to your opponent while being immune to damage coming back is super duper good. We'll move on from Dark Angels, but that's certainly not to say that there aren't other amazing units in the Codex. So many of those Deathwing and Ravenwing options are so phenomenal. Dark Angels have such a deep stable of incredible options to take, and we see a lot of variety in different Dark Angels builds. Talking about Deathwatch now, though, this was a very difficult one to pick, because Deathwatch, while they are a Space Marine Codex, function totally differently than any other Space Marine. For my first pick here, I'm going to talk about the Redemptor Dreadnought. Redemptor Dreadnoughts have basically everything. They've got damage reduction, they've got a super strong melee attack, they've got incredible ranged output, but the one thing they're missing is an invulnerable save. Well, let me introduce you to the Dominus Aegis, which gives a 5+ invulnerable save to any core units within 6 inches of the bearer, and also increases the bearer's armor save by 1, which is pretty solid. This relic makes a brick of Deathwatch Redemptor Dreadnoughts very difficult to remove, and saves a lot of time and effort that other factions would have to put into protecting their Dreadnoughts with a Librarian toting Psychic Fortress or a similar defensive ability. Deathwatch just do it straight up with a free 5+ invulnerable save, and it's pretty awesome. Being a core unit in Deathwatch as well means they benefit from the tome of the Ectoclades, allowing the Deathwatch player to choose 1 data sheet at the start of a battle round to get full rerolls to wound against them. That means that you can focus fire down 1 or 2 very specific targets and makes these Redemptor Dreadnoughts super duper efficient. Moving on, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Proteus kill teams. While almost every kill team option in the Deathwatch supplement is phenomenally good, the Proteus kill team is especially, I think, with some super good troop options. Inside a Proteus kill team, you can take things like Space Marine Bikers that get the infantry keyword if they're also in a unit with infantry, which is easy to do since you can also take things like Vanguard Veterans. The standard Deathwatch veterans in that unit also have a very solid selection of ranged attacks, being able to take things like Stormbolters or the Deathwatch Shotgun, which has a litany of super cool ammunition types it can fire. Proteus kill teams are the backbone of most Deathwatch lists, and once you combat squad them out, give you a lot of flexibility, able to take more aggressive units of Vanguard Veterans and Bikers, alongside more range-oriented objective holders that can sit on your backline with those regular Deathwatch veteran models. Well, there's definitely a place in the Deathwatch army for all of the different kill team types. The Proteus kill team is certainly the most flexible and the one you'll take the most of. And with that, we'll move on to the other Black Armored Space Marine chapter that always gets confused for Deathwatch. Let's talk about some Iron Hands. Now, I did a super long video about Iron Hands, talking with Fushini, who's a regular competitive player and has a couple GT top placings, as well as at least 1 win under his belt, and his Iron Hands list. And some of the things that we talk about in that video, I'm going to cover here. First off, number 1 unit in Iron Hands, in my humble opinion, Volkite Contemptor Dreadnought. This Relic Contemptor with the Cyclone Missile Launcher and 2 twin Volkite Culverins is good in every single Space Marine chapter, and I think you'd see 1 or more in basically any list from any Space Marine army. That said, Iron Hands have particular synergy with at least 1 of them, because you can use the March of the Ancient stratagem to turn it into a character. That means that not only is it untargetable and able to be bodyguarded, but it gets the benefit of things like Warlord traits. You can use Warlord traits like Merciless Logic on it to give it exploding attack rolls, target it with target protocols to give it additional rerolls. It's just a super duper efficient unit that does way more damage than it has any right to. Another unit that's very good in Iron Hands are going to be Devastator Squads. These things, coming out of a drop pod or even just deploying in your deployment zone and jumping out of a ruin on turn 1, are super efficient, given that the normal downside of Devastator Squads, which is that they are -1 to hit when they move with those heavy weapons, is ignored by Iron Hands while they're in the Devastator Doctrine. This means that a drop pod coming in and disembarking those Devastator Squads in a solid position that has good lines of sight on the first turn that they disembark will be ignoring that -1 penalty and giving them reroll 1s to hit, meaning you don't have to supply that from any other characters in your army. This makes Devastators super efficient trading units that can just jump in, do a bunch of damage, maybe they die, it doesn't really matter because they've usually made their points back after 1 shooting phase. Now, I just noticed, but we actually had all 3 Black Armored Space Marine chapters in a row, because we're going to move on to Raven Guard now. And this one was a little bit of a toughie. I'll talk first about Vanguard Veterans in Raven Guard, which have a particularly special place because they get a lot of benefit that they don't in other Space Marine chapters. First off, the Swift and Deadly Warlord trait gives them access to Advance and Charge, so they're basically cosplaying as Whitescars. That gets particularly dangerous when you combo it with Master of Ambush or the Infiltrator stratagem to allow them to pre-game move or forward deploy. That means these Vanguard veterans can start in a very aggressive position, potentially behind cover. If you have some in the midboard, you can even redeploy them into a particularly good place once you see who's won the role to go first, and then jump out when the time is right and do some significant damage to your opponent's army. Raven Guard Alpha Strikes are legendary, and units like Vanguard veterans with that ludicrously long threat range, especially on the top of turn 1, are the backbone of that style of play. In 8th edition, the metagame was rocked by Raven Guard Centurion lists, and while they've been nerfed many times over, especially in that 9th edition codex, making Centurions significantly less powerful, I do think it's still important to talk about units like Assault Centurions using the Strike from the Shadows stratagem to teleport themselves onto the table. With their shiny new 12-inch range flamers, as well as the ability to mount Hurricane Bolters, these guys can pop in anywhere they want on the table outside of 9 inches of enemies and make attacks with all of those incredible weapons. Because you can only bring them in during the Tactical Doctrine being active, they also get that extra AP on all of their weapons, meaning that even though they don't get the benefits of Bolter Discipline or the core keyword, their volume of fire at a decent AP is usually enough to put significant damage on most targets. While they're definitely less efficient than they were, if you're looking at Raven Guard, I definitely would still consider at least one unit of these guys. Moving on, we'll talk about Salamanders. These guys have a ton of interesting synergies inside their faction, and especially with Gravis armored models like Eradicators or Aggressors. +1 to wound and their reroll to wound from the chapter tactic is solid for Eradicators. Aggressors are a little bit harder to use. You can use them to bodyguard your more valuable fighters by threatening the Born Protector stratagem to allow them to overwatch stuff that is charging into your brick, or use them to self-sacrifice for your Eradicators, allowing them to survive in the center of the table for a little bit longer. Well, I don't think Foot Salamanders is really the best way to play Space Marines in general. If you are playing Salamanders, they do have the most synergy with that style of model, and that's definitely a solid way to build the army. Now, we talked about some interesting impulsor technology when we talked about Black Templars, and Salamanders might have an even more interesting synergy with the impulsor, and that is when using the Relentless Determination stratagem on that impulsor. The Relentless Determination stratagem allows you to, if a unit has not advanced or fallen back this turn, count it as remaining stationary during its movement phase activation for, and I quote here, all rules purposes, which means that if you move that transport and then disembark units from inside the transport is not considered to have moved, meaning the units can act as normal. That assault vehicle rule that would normally prevent them from charging if they disembarked after the transport moved, it no longer applies. That allows you to fill up an impulsor with a unit like Blade Guard veterans, move 14 inches, disembark them, move the Blade Guard veterans, and charge, giving them a similar threat range to the Black Templars version, but this time with getting the effect of having charged, meaning their shock assault turns on and any other abilities that they have active from having charged. Abilities like Born Heroes or Whirlwind of Rage from a successor chapter will also come into effect. With easy access to +1 to wound from Crucible of Battle, this makes Salamander's Blade Guard veterans and other melee units from inside those assault vehicles not only super fast, but also super duper deadly. Now let's move on to another animal-themed chapter. We'll talk about Space Wolves next. We already talked about the Redemptor Dreadnought inside a Deathwatch army, but I'd also like to talk about it inside Space Wolves as well. One of the principal ways you deal with a Redemptor Dreadnought army is alpha striking those Redemptor Dreadnoughts down. Redemptor Dreadnoughts being such a powerful ranged option means that your opponent is often incentivized to come up and attack them at close range or in melee in order to stop them from just waddling forward and shooting most of their army to death. Unfortunately, that's very difficult in Space Wolves, not only because they have the support of their character brick, especially with relics like Armor of Rust, forcing enemies to fight last while they're in melee with them, meaning the Redemptor Dreadnought will probably get to punch you before you punch it if you moved up to engage it, but the Redemptor Dreadnought itself can heroically intervene as well. Potentially 6 inches with the counterattack stratagem, meaning that engaging these things in melee becomes really hairy. This compounds if you've added effects like Rites of War or Warden of the Ancients off of a Tech Marine onto them for additional attacks or the potential objective secured, meaning that if a Space Wolves Dreadnought brick takes an objective in the center of the table, it's so difficult to move in and stop it from continuing to score that objective. Speaking of Dreadnoughts, let's keep talking about Dreadnoughts and talk about the diminutive little boy, the Wolfen Dreadnought. These guys, in my opinion, are criminally underplayed. Able to mount a Blizzard Shield, which is effectively the invulnerable save half of a Storm Shield, meaning that this Wolfen Dreadnought with no support is 8 wounds at Duty Eternal for that -1 damage behind a 4+ invulnerable save, which will block basically half of all damage incoming. Meaning that if you're getting hit by 2 or 3 damage weapons, that Duty Eternal is knocking down by 1/3, and then that invulnerable save is saving an additional half of that, you're only taking about 20 or 30% of the normal damage that you would be. This makes Wolfen Dreadnoughts ridiculously difficult to kill, especially since you can combo that with some powerful weapons, including a Wolf Claw that automatically rerolls its wounds, or a Great Axe you can use to double your attacks. Either of these weapons options are solid, and compound with the fact that the Wolfen Dreadnought can mount 2 heavy flamers, meaning its crappy ballistic skill is not an issue. While they don't get the core keyword, Wolfen Dreadnoughts also innately reroll their charge rolls, so you don't need to put too much thought into buffing their threat range, and at a base speed 8 rather than the normal box Dreadnought speed 6, they are relatively speedy, especially advancing up the table. I love me some Wolfen Dreadnoughts, and certainly a very solid choice for just a couple points in a Space Wolves army. Now, moving on from the wild and crazy Space Wolves, we'll talk about their goody two-shoes buddies, the Ultramarines. One synergy I want to talk about here is the synergy with rapid redeployment, which allows the Ultramarine player to redeploy their units back into their deployment zone after the roll to go first has occurred. This means that Ultramarines have particular synergy with forward deploying units, especially things like Eliminators, Incursors, Infiltrators, or, most importantly, the Invictor Tactical Warsuit. I rarely see an Ultramarines list without 3 Invictor Tactical Warsuits because they allow you to start your deployment step just literally dropping them directly in front of your opponent's deployment zone. If the Ultramarines player then wins the roll to go first, they rocket 3 Invictors into their opponent's army, shooting and punching with those 3 damage fists and a billion million little tiny attacks that they make with their ranged weapons. But if they don't win that roll, it's no big deal. They'll just use that rapid redeployment, pull those Invictor Warsuits back into cover in their deployment zone, and use them as more of a fire base, firing those autocannons and heavy stubbers downrange while the rest of their army moves up the table. Invictor Warsuits definitely lost a lot of shine in the 9th edition Codex, but I do think that the best home for them, and certainly one of the best ways to play Ultramarines right now, is using that forward deploy in conjunction with the redeployment to get some very consistent alpha strikes on your opponent's army. And with that, we'll move on to the last chapter in our discussion today, one of the most powerful Space Marine chapters in the meta right now. Let's talk about White Scars. Now, the top pick for White Scars I think is really easy. The Vanguard Veteran is not only one of the best options in the Space Marine Codex, but benefits from almost every single buff that White Scars can give them. The ability to advance and charge increases their already relatively formidable threat range through the roof, as we talked about already with Raven Guard. The fact that you usually kit them out with chain swords or lightning claws to keep their points down and give them a high volume of attacks, doubling their damage with the Assault Doctrine Super Doctrine is phenomenally good. If you can stack on some additional buffs like Corsaro Khan giving them +1 to wound, Vanguard veterans do a phenomenal amount of damage inside a White Scars army. While I would recommend almost every Space Marine list take Vanguard veterans to give themselves some mobility and a little bit of melee punch, White Scars are definitely the best home for them. Similarly, Inceptors are another pick that are super duper powerful in White Scars. The ability to advance and fire their weapons without penalty is a really big deal, and gives Inceptors a little bit of additional mobility and some ability to get around line of sight blockers that they normally don't have in other chapters. While White Scars do have some pretty solid threat ranges, one thing that they can fall behind on is their ability to deal damage at medium to long range, and having Inceptors that can move potentially 16 inches and then fire with those 18-inch range weapons, especially on turn 2, that one turn that White Scars are forced to stay in Tactical Doctrine, means that they have something to do on that turn and can reach out and touch enemy units that they wouldn't normally be able to deal with in melee. While White Scars usually get branded as a biker-centric chapter, it is a little bit weird that they have more benefits for the jump infantry than even a chapter like Blood Angels, but I mean, it is what it is, and it definitely makes White Scars one of the most powerful chapters in the super faction. But with that, that's it. We've talked about every single Space Marine supplement, except for Blood Ravens. Get out of here, Blood Ravens. Nobody cares about you. Big thanks for watching to the end of the video. I want to throw a quick shout out to everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, as well as YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. All you people are phenomenal. I love you very much. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.